In December of 1975, an engineer at Kodak named Steve Sasson finished building a camera that didn't use film. It was the size of a toaster. It weighed 8 pounds. It captured a black and white image at 1/10 of a megapixel onto a cassette tape. Reading the image back out took 23 seconds. It was the first digital camera ever made, and the company that built it was the largest and most profitable photography company on Earth. 37 years later, that same company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The story everyone tells about Kodak is that they missed the digital revolution, that they were a film company that didn't see the future coming. That story's wrong. Kodak saw the future earlier than anyone. They built the future in a basement in 1975. And then they chose deliberately, year after year, not to ship it. This is the fourth case study in a framework I use on this channel, the 4 forces. Quick recap. Every company is shaped by 4 forces: market, the conditions they operate in, money, how they're funded, and what that costs them; management, the decisions made at the top; moment, the timing and events they didn't choose. All 4 are always present. Only one is decisive. Let's find Kodak's. For most of the 20th century, Kodak was photography, not a photography company, the photography company. By the 1970s, they had about 90% of the U.S. film market and about 85% of the camera market. They were as close to a pure monopoly as a consumer products company gets. The film business was extraordinary. Cameras were sold roughly at cost. They were the razor. Film was the blade. Kodak made its money on every roll a customer bought, every roll they got developed, every print they made. The margins on film were somewhere north of 70%. Then in 1975, same year as Sasson's prototype, the market started to give Kodak its first warning. Japanese competitors were taking the camera business. Polaroid was dominant in instant photography. And the underlying technology, silver halide film, had not fundamentally changed in 100 years. The market shifted seriously starting in the late 1990s. Digital cameras went from novelty to mass market between roughly 1998 and 2003. By 2003, digital camera sales overtook film camera sales globally. By 2010, smartphones were displacing dedicated cameras entirely. That's a hard market, but, and this matters, Kodak's competitors lived through the same market. Fujifilm, the Japanese rival, made the transition. Fuji's still around today, profitable in healthcare imaging and specialty chemicals. The film market vanished for Fuji exactly the way it did for Kodak. They just made different choices about what to do next. Market, a hard transition, but survivable. Kodak's financial structure was not the killer here, but it shaped what was possible. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Kodak was profitable. The film business kept generating cash even as it shrank. The company had a strong balance sheet, an investment-grade credit rating, and the ability to raise capital when it wanted to. This is actually unusual for the kinds of stories this channel tells. Most companies that die are killed by financial constraints, debt, capital structure, ownership. Kodak had cash. Kodak had options. Kodak could have bought the future. What Kodak did with that cash matters, though. From 1990 to 2007, Kodak spent more than $2.5 billion on share buybacks, while the digital camera market they had invented passed them by. They paid out steady dividends. They preserved the appearance of a healthy industrial company. What they did less of was the boring work of redirecting their massive R&D and manufacturing capability toward digital. They had the patents. They had the engineering talent. They licensed digital imaging IP to other companies for billions of dollars. They just kept treating the digital business as something separate from and second to the film business. Money wasn't decisive. Money was sufficient. The question was what Kodak chose to do with it. Money, a non-issue. Kodak had the cash and the credit. This is the decisive force, and the case is overwhelming. Start with Sasson's prototype in 1975. Sasson briefed Kodak's executives. The reaction in his own later telling was, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." Kodak filed the patents. Kodak funded continued research, and Kodak did not ship a digital camera until 1991, 16 years later. Even then, the product was a professional system called the DCS 100, built on a Nikon body priced around $20,000 and aimed at photojournalists and scientific users, not the consumer base Kodak had spent 100 years building. The reasoning was understandable. Every digital camera Kodak sold was a customer who wouldn't buy film. The film business had margins of 70% or more. The digital camera business, even at scale, would have margins maybe a third of that. Selling digital cameras to your own customers meant trading high-margin recurring revenue for low-margin one-time revenue. This is the innovator's dilemma. It has been written about in business school for 30 years. Christensen's book came out in 1997, while Kodak was living the example in real time. But Kodak's specific decisions are what made this terminal. In 2001, Kodak bought O-Photo, an online photo printing service, for $58 million. The thinking was that even if film went away, people would still print their digital photos. That was a defensible bet. What Kodak failed to do was build O-Photo into the dominant social photo sharing platform, which is what the same business model became 3 years later when Flickr and Facebook arrived. Kodak owned a photo sharing site at exactly the moment when photo sharing was about to become the central activity of the consumer internet. They kept it as a printing service. Through the 2000s, Kodak shipped digital cameras, but never positioned itself as a digital company. The brand stayed associated with film. Each successive CEO promised a turnaround, executed a partial reorganization, and was gone within 4 or 5 years. By the time Antonio Perez took over as CEO in 2005 and finally tried to bet the company on commercial inkjet printing, Kodak's window had closed. Perez's strategy wasn't crazy on its merits. Commercial printing was a real adjacent market, but it required Kodak to walk away from consumer photography just as smartphones were arriving to walk away from it for them. Even the digital camera market they could have dominated was about to get cannibalized again. In January of 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11. They emerged in 2013 as a much smaller business focused on commercial printing and imaging. The consumer photography company was gone. Management decisive. The 2008 financial crisis squeezed Kodak the way it squeezed everyone, but it wasn't the killing blow. The smartphone arrived as a more lasting moment force. The iPhone in 2007, mass camera phone adoption by 2010, and that did accelerate the collapse, but the smartphone wasn't the cause either. By 2007, Kodak's chance to be the dominant company in consumer digital photography was already gone. Canon, Nikon, Sony, and Samsung had taken the digital camera market. The moment force mostly determined the timing, not the outcome, moment, and accelerant, not the cause. So let's grade them out. Market, a hard transition, but Fuji proved it was survivable. Money, a non-issue. Kodak had cash, credit, and time. Moment, an accelerant. The cell phone closed the door, but the door was already closing. Management, decisive. Kodak didn't die because they failed to see digital. They died because they saw it, built it, and chose not to commit. Year after year, the rational choice, protect the film business, preserve the dividend, manage the transition slowly, was the choice that locked in long-term decline. There's a useful pattern in this. The Toys R Us episode showed what happens when financial structure forecloses your options. The Sears episode showed what happens when ownership runs the company as an asset to be liquidated. Kodak shows the third case, which is the one most current executives should worry about. What happens when you have every resource you need and you make rational small decisions that add up to a fatal large one? Kodak's executives weren't fools. They were measured on quarterly film revenue. They were rewarded for protecting margins. They were operating under exactly the incentives that, applied honestly, produced exactly the outcome we got. The lesson generalizes. When a market shifts under a healthy company, the killing question is rarely, did they see it? It's, did they have the discipline to commit before the math was obvious? Kodak's answer was no for 37 years. Next case, the only company in this lineup that was actually saved by ruthless discipline. Steve Jobs comes back to Apple in 1997, and the move that mattered most was not the iMac.